Something just happened with the Detroit Lions, and if you've been paying close attention to how this roster is being built, this move tells you a lot more than it might seem at first glance. The Lions have officially added another edge player to the room, bringing in Payton Turner, a former first-round pick who is coming off an injured season, and this is one of those signings that immediately splits the fan base depending on how you look at it, because on one hand you see the profile. This is a guy with legitimate size at 6'6", around 270 pounds, someone who physically fits exactly what you'd want on the edge, especially in a rotation behind Aiden Hutchinson and alongside the rest of that defensive front. From a pure build and theoretical upside standpoint, you understand why a front office would take a look here. Players like this don't just grow on trees, and when they're available on what is expected to be a low-end deal, teams convince themselves it's worth the risk. But then you look at the reality, and this is where the conversation gets a lot more complicated. Payton Turner hasn't been able to stay on the field consistently throughout his career. He missed the entire 2025 season due to injury. Before that, even when he did play in 2024, appearing in 16 games, his overall career availability has been extremely limited. 8 games in 2023, 5 in 2022, and it paints a very clear picture. This is a player who has struggled to stay healthy year after year. And when you combine that with the production, it raises even more questions. We're talking about a total of 31 career games, with 2 forced fumbles, 5 sacks, and around 50 total tackles. That's not the kind of output that suggests this is anything close to a game-changing addition. This is not a headline move. This is not a move that shifts expectations for the defense. This is, at its core, a depth signing. So now the real discussion begins. What exactly are the Lions trying to accomplish with a move like this? Because when you look at the current edge rotation, you already have Aiden Hutchinson leading the group with names like DJ Wanham, Tyler Lacey, Trevor Nowaske, and Ahmed Hassanein in the mix. Adding Payton Turner into that group doesn't suddenly transform the unit, but it does add another body, another option, another gamble. And that's really the word here, gamble. This feels like the kind of move where the front office is saying, if he stays healthy, maybe we get something out of him. But that if is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because history tells you that injuries have been the defining factor of his career so far. Shoulder issues, turf toe, rib injuries. It's been one thing after another, and at some point you have to ask yourself how many times you can bet on a different outcome. That's where some of the frustration starts to come in. Not necessarily because of Payton Turner as a player, but because of the pattern. Bringing in players with injury histories and hoping they can contribute has been something fans have seen before, and when it doesn't work out, it leaves you right back where you started, needing to fill that same hole again. At the same time, you can also understand the logic if this is strictly about depth. If this is a low-risk contract, if this is a player you're not relying on to be a major contributor, then the downside is limited. You're not committing major resources here. You're simply adding competition and seeing if there's anything left to unlock. But here's the key point. This move cannot be the answer at edge. It just can't be. If the Lions are serious about taking that next step, about truly elevating this defense, they still need a real impact player opposite Hutchinson. And based on everything we're seeing, that's going to have to come from the draft, because free agency at this point isn't giving you that solution anymore. So when you look at this signing in the bigger picture, it almost feels like a placeholder, a depth addition, a we'll see what happens type of move, while the real plan is still ahead. But it also puts even more pressure on what comes next, especially when it comes to how they approach the draft. Because if they don't address that edge position early, if they pass on the opportunity to bring in a true difference maker, then moves like this start to look a lot more questionable, and that's why this signing is getting such a mixed reaction. It's not just about Payton Turner, it's about what this represents and whether the team is repeating a pattern that hasn't consistently worked in the past. So now I want to hear from you. When you look at this move, do you see it as a smart low-risk depth addition, or does it feel like the Lions are once again taking the same gamble and expecting a different result? And that's where this conversation really starts to shift, because once you accept that this move is likely just about depth, you're forced to zoom out and look at the bigger strategy the Detroit Lions are building right now. This isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a pattern, and whether that pattern is calculated or concerning depends entirely on what happens next. Because let's be real for a second, if Payton Turner ends up being exactly what his career has shown so far, a player who struggles to stay on the field, then this signing won't move the needle at all. It becomes just another name that cycles through the depth chart, another situation where the team has to adjust mid-season because availability becomes an issue again. And that's exactly what some fans are worried about, the idea that this is something we've seen before. But there's also another angle to this that you can't ignore. The Lions are not paying for production here, they're paying for potential at a discount. And in the NFL, teams take these kinds of swings all the time, especially when the cost is low. If somehow, for the first time in his career, Turner manages to stay healthy, you're suddenly looking at a player with first-round traits, elite size, and the kind of physical tools that can actually contribute in a rotational role. That's the gamble. That's the entire bet. And it becomes a lot easier to accept that gamble if, and this is a big if, the front office follows through with the real move that everyone knows still needs to happen. Because no one looking at this roster right now can honestly say the edge position is fully solved. Not with the current production, not with the current uncertainty behind Aiden Hutchinson. So this brings us to the draft, and this is where everything becomes critical. The Lions have to walk into that draft with a clear priority. Edge rusher is not just a need, it's one of the most important positions on this entire roster. And if they hesitate, if they wait too long, or if they try to get too creative, then the pressure only builds on players like Payton Turner to somehow over-deliver on expectations that realistically shouldn't be placed on them. That's how you end up in trouble, because now instead of being a depth piece, now you're asking a player with a long injury history to step into a bigger role, and that's where things can fall apart quickly. That's why this move only makes sense if it stays in its lane. Depth, rotation, low risk, low expectation, anything beyond that, and you're asking for problems. At the same time, you can see what the Lions are trying to build in terms of volume. They're stacking bodies on the defensive line, increasing competition, making sure there are options available. And in theory, that's not a bad approach. Injuries happen, rotations matter, and having multiple players who can step in has value over the course of a long season. But again, depth only works when the top of the room is solidified. And right now, that's still the question mark. So when you put everything together, this signing doesn't feel like a statement move. It feels like a supporting move, one that only looks smart if the bigger plan comes together the way it's supposed to. Otherwise, it risks blending into a pattern that fans are already starting to question. And that's why this next phase is everything. The draft isn't just important, it's defining. It's where the Lions either confirm that they have a clear vision for this defense, or leave people wondering if they're relying too heavily on what-if scenarios. Because at the end of the day, that's what Payton Turner represents right now. A what-if. What if he stays healthy? What if the potential finally shows up? What if this turns into a steal? But the Lions can't build their defensive identity on what if. They need certainty somewhere in that room, so now it all comes down to execution, the pieces they add next, the priorities they set, and how aggressive they're willing to be when the opportunity is there. If they get that part right, this signing will be forgotten in the best way possible. Just another depth move that quietly did its job, but if they don't, then this becomes part of a much bigger conversation about direction and decision making. And if you keep pulling on that thread, you start to realize this isn't just about one player or one signing, and it's about how far this current approach can actually take the Detroit Lions when expectations are no longer about rebuilding, but about contending. Because that's the real shift here. This is no longer a team trying to figure itself out. This is a team that has already shown it can compete, that has already built a foundation, and now the margin for error gets smaller. Moves like this, even if they seem minor, start to carry more weight because they reflect how the front office is choosing to fill the final gaps. And the edge position is not a small gap. It's one of the most important positions in modern football. It affects everything, and pass rush, coverage, pressure rate, how aggressive your defense can be. And when you have a player like Aiden Hutchinson on one side, it almost demands that you find a legitimate counterpart on the other side to fully unlock what this defense can become. That's why relying on depth, moves, and upside players can only take you so far. At some point, you need proven impact. You need someone offenses actually have to game plan for, not just someone who rotates in and out hoping to make a play here and there. And that's where the tension is right now. Because if you're a fan watching this, you can understand the logic behind low-risk moves. You can understand taking chances on players with physical tools. But at the same time, there's a growing urgency. There's a sense that the team is close. And when you're close, you don't want to leave critical positions to chance. You don't want to be sitting halfway through the season looking back at these decisions and wondering if more could have been done when the opportunity was there. That's what makes this moment so important. Not just the signing itself, but what it represents in the time timeline of this team. This is the phase where good teams separate themselves from great ones. It's about precision, yes, but it's also about knowing when to be aggressive, when to stop experimenting, and when to lock in the pieces that truly elevate your ceiling. So when you look at Peyton Turner again through that lens, he becomes less of a focal point and more of a symbol of a strategy that can work in small doses but becomes risky if leaned on too heavily. Because the truth is, if everything goes right, he's a bonus. If things go wrong, he's replaceable. And that's exactly why the Lions cannot afford to treat this as anything more than what it is. The real story is still ahead. It's in how they respond to this. It's in whether they follow this up with a move that brings real stability to that edge room. It's in whether they recognize that while depth is important, difference makers are what define seasons. And that's why fans are watching so closely right now. Not because of this one signing, but because of what it might signal about the decisions still to come. So as this offseason continues to unfold, every move starts connecting to the next. Every decision builds the bigger picture. And right now, that picture is still incomplete. And that's exactly why this conversation isn't going away anytime soon, because the more you look at it, the more it feels like the Lions are walking a very fine line between calculated depth building and unnecessary risk. Think about it from a long-term perspective. If this front office truly believes they are close to competing at the highest level, then every roster spot starts to matter more. Every decision has to align with that goal. And when you keep circling back to players with significant injury histories, it raises a fair question about how much risk is too much risk, because this isn't just about one case. This is about repetition. When you consistently bring in players who have struggled to stay healthy, you're not just betting on talent, you're betting against history. And history, especially in the NFL, usually doesn't change overnight. Availability is one of the most valuable traits a player can have, and it's also one of the hardest things to suddenly fix if it's been an issue for years. So now imagine the scenario where the Lions go into the season with this exact mindset. You have your core pieces, you have your depth built on potential, and then injuries hit, because they always do. Suddenly, you're not talking about depth anymore, you're talking about reliance. And that's when these types of signings get tested the most. That's when fans start asking tougher questions. Why didn't they secure a more reliable option? Why didn't they invest more heavily in a position that clearly needed it? Why are they once again trying to outsmart a problem instead of directly solving it? And to be fair, there's still time for the Lions to answer all of those questions the right way. None of this is locked in yet. The roster is not finished. The plan is not complete. But the margin for error is shrinking with every move that leans more toward projection than certainty. At the same time, you can't completely dismiss the upside scenario, because that's the part that keeps this move alive. If Peyton Turner somehow breaks the pattern, if he stays on the field and finds a role in this rotation, then suddenly this looks like a smart, efficient pickup. A low-cost addition that gave you more than expected. But again, everything about that outcome depends on something we haven't consistently seen yet. And that's the core of the debate. Are the Lions identifying undervalued talent that just needs the right situation? Or are they repeating a cycle that relies